the war that became China's classroom. We may be missing the point. While Washington believes it is tightening the economic noose around Beijing, something very different is unfolding in real time. China is quietly doing three things simultaneously. First, it is purchasing massive quantities of Russian oil through northern land and maritime routes. These routes are almost completely immune to disruptions in the Persian Gulf. Second, it is watching this war like a live training exercise. And third, it is gathering something far more valuable than oil: data. Every missile launched, every carrier maneuver, every air defense response, all of it is being observed by Chinese satellites and signals intelligence platforms that are quietly learning from American military operations in real time. From Beijing's perspective, this war is not a crisis, it is a masterclass. Think about what the United States is revealing: logistics networks, targeting doctrine, munition consumption rates, response times, supply chain vulnerabilities. For China's military planners, this conflict is effectively a free documentary series explaining how American war planning works, episode by episode, strike by strike, lesson by lesson. And while Washington debates policy on television, the People's Liberation Army is recording every frame. Because what they are watching is not just a regional conflict, it is a preview of how the United States would fight a major war. And that preview is worth more to Beijing than any intelligence operation they could have run themselves. But the military lessons are only one piece of the story. The economic consequences are beginning to ripple outward in ways nobody is discussing. At the moment, roughly 984 oil tankers are stuck in or around the Strait of Hormuz. That represents nearly 22% of the global fleet. Energy supply contracts are signed months in advance. 3 months, 6 months, longer. The true consequences have not yet reached global markets. The world is still operating on oil that was purchased before the war began. When those contracts expire, the real shock begins. And that shock will not just affect the Middle East. It will affect food prices, shipping costs, electricity bills, and inflation across the global economy. But to understand how we reach this point, we need to zoom out. Because what is unfolding right now does not look like a carefully designed strategy. It looks like something else entirely. Improvisation. Improvisation dressed up as policy. And the deeper you examine it, the more obvious that becomes. The strategy that never existed. Now step back from the headlines for a moment and ask the question nobody in Washington seems willing to ask out loud. What exactly was the strategy? Not the press conference version, not the talking points about restoring deterrence or projecting strength. The actual strategic plan that connects the first missile fired to the political outcome that is supposed to follow. Because when you trace the chain of events backwards, something uncomfortable begins to emerge. The war that began on February 28th did not unfold like a carefully constructed campaign. It unfolded like a reaction to pressure, to politics, to assumptions that had been repeated for so long that they eventually started sounding like facts. For years, the idea circulated through policy circles that Iran was fragile, that its government was brittle, that if enough pressure was applied quickly enough, the entire system would fracture. It was a theory built on comparisons that sounded persuasive but were fundamentally flawed. Venezuela, Iraq, Libya, countries where regimes weakened under economic strain, political division, or direct invasion. The assumption was that Iran would follow the same pattern. But Iran is not Venezuela, it is not Libya, and it is certainly not Iraq in 2003. Iran is a country of nearly 90 million people with decades of experience operating under sanctions, isolation, and pressure. Its economy has been distorted by restrictions for years, which means many of the shocks that would cripple another country have already been absorbed. This is the first misunderstanding that shaped the war. The second was military. The United States launched Operation Epic Fury with overwhelming force. Nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours. Stealth aircraft, cruise missiles, long-range bombers. On paper, it looked like the kind of shock and awe operation. But there was a problem hidden inside those numbers. Air power can destroy targets. It cannot create political outcomes by itself. History is brutally consistent on this point. In Korea, American bombers flattened entire cities and the war still ended in stalemate. In Vietnam, the most technologically advanced air campaign ever conducted failed to break the enemy's will. Even in World War II, Japan did not surrender after months of devastating bombing until the geopolitical situation changed completely. Airstrikes can degrade infrastructure. They can weaken military capabilities. But regime change without ground forces has almost never worked. And everyone inside the Pentagon knows this, which brings us back to the original question. If the objective was regime change, air power alone was never going to achieve it. If the objective was deterrence, the result has been escalation. If the objective was economic pressure on China through Iranian energy flows, the numbers show that strategy collapses under scrutiny. Because China's dependence on Iranian energy is roughly 1.5% of its total consumption. 1.5. That is the scale of the supposed pressure point that triggered the most significant military escalation in the Middle East in decades. Meanwhile, the consequences are spreading outward across the global economy. Tankers stalled in the Strait of Hormuz, oil markets tightening, insurance costs exploding, energy contracts being rewritten months into the future. The war is already reshaping the financial system. And the uncomfortable truth is this: when you analyze the sequence of decisions that produced this conflict, you do not see a coherent grand strategy unfolding step by step. You see improvisation. You see leaders responding to events faster than they can control them. You see assumptions colliding with reality. And you see a geopolitical gamble that is now unfolding in real time across energy markets, military supply chains, and global financial networks, which is why the next phase of this conflict matters far more than the first. Because the world is now discovering what happens when a war begins before anyone has fully answered the most basic strategic question of all: what happens next? There is a story that circulated quietly through Washington policy circles for years. A simple story, a convenient one. It said that China's economic rise depended on energy flowing through the Middle East. Cut that flow, and you squeeze Beijing's economy. Disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, and China feels the pain first. On paper, it sounded logical. The world's fastest-growing industrial power, importing millions of barrels of oil every day. Tankers crossing the Gulf, moving through one narrow maritime corridor where nearly a fifth of the planet's oil supply passes. Close that corridor, and the theory said the world's second-largest economy would suddenly find itself starved of fuel. That belief became the foundation of a much larger strategic assumption. If Iran could be weakened, the energy routes could be disrupted. The geopolitical logic looked clean, simple, almost elegant. But there was one problem. The numbers never supported the story. China spent the last 20 years quietly redesigning its entire energy system, executing a long-term industrial plan that began in the early 2000s. While Western economies debated climate policy, Beijing was building something else entirely: a diversified energy structure designed to absorb shocks. Today, China produces enormous amounts of electricity domestically, massive hydroelectric dams, expanding nuclear power, the world's largest renewable energy sector, solar farms stretching across deserts, wind fields covering entire provinces, and an electric vehicle fleet growing faster than anywhere else on Earth. The result is an energy profile very different from what Washington planners imagined. China's energy self-sufficiency rate sits around 84%. That means only about 16% of the energy the Chinese economy consumes comes from abroad. And within that slice, oil represents just a portion of the total mix. Even more important is how that oil arrives. For years, China built alternative supply routes designed to bypass the most vulnerable maritime choke points. Pipelines stretching across Central Asia, rail networks connecting energy supplies across the Eurasian landmass, and perhaps most importantly, a massive shadow shipping network operating outside traditional regulatory frameworks. Hundreds of tankers moving crude under shifting identities. Ships that rename themselves mid-voyage and disable tracking systems. Vessels conduct transfers at sea before delivering cargo to Asian ports. This shadow fleet now represents nearly 1/5 of global capacity. The assumption that Middle Eastern energy flows could be neatly controlled or disrupted was never entirely accurate. While Washington was focused on the Strait of Hormuz, China and Russia were negotiating new land-based energy corridors. Gas pipelines stretching thousands of miles across Siberia. Infrastructure projects designed to reduce dependence on maritime routes. Energy that travels through steel buried under mountains cannot be blockaded by naval fleets. This was never an economy built to collapse under pressure from a single choke point. Meanwhile, the countries most dependent on the Strait of Hormuz are not China at all. Japan receives roughly 90% of its oil there. South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and several European economies face similar vulnerabilities. The strategy that was supposed to pressure China may end up hurting America's own allies far more severely. Energy markets are already reacting. Shipping costs rising, insurance premiums surging, supply contracts shifting as traders attempt to anticipate the next disruption. The myth becomes harder to sustain because the global energy system of 20 years ago is not the system of today. And the country that prepared most carefully for that reality may not be the one that started the war. There's a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman that most people never think about. On a map, it looks almost insignificant, just a thin channel connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, but that narrow channel carries one of the heaviest economic burdens on the planet. It is called the Strait of Hormuz. And every single day, under normal conditions, roughly 20 million barrels of oil move through that passage. Tankers carrying energy from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar. Cargo destined for refineries thousands of miles away. Japan, South Korea, India, Europe, China. For decades, the strait has been described as the most important energy choke point in the world, which is why so many strategic planners believed it could be weaponized. The idea was simple. If conflict ever disrupted the Strait of Hormuz, the resulting pressure on oil supplies would ripple into the Chinese economy. Factories would slow, industrial production would tighten, economic growth would falter. But that theory collapses once you look carefully at who actually depends on that waterway. Japan receives more than 90% of its imported oil through the strait. South Korea depends on the same route for the majority of its energy. The Philippines is even more exposed. Large portions of Europe still rely on Middle Eastern shipments after losing access to Russian energy. In other words, the economies most vulnerable to disruption in the Gulf are not America's strategic rivals. They are America's allies. When shipping through Hormuz slows, Tokyo feels it immediately. Seoul feels it immediately. European energy markets react almost overnight. China, by contrast, has spent years preparing, oil arriving through diversified shipping routes, land pipelines across Central Asia, Russian energy supplies moving through continental infrastructure that cannot be intercepted by naval patrols, which means the pressure created by instability in the Gulf spreads unevenly across the global economy. The countries Washington depends on for its Indo-Pacific strategy feel the shock first. Insurance rates for tankers begin to surge. Shipping companies hesitate to send vessels where missiles and drones may appear. Charter prices spike. Traders scramble to secure future supply contracts months ahead of delivery. And slowly the consequences begin to cascade outward. Refineries pay more for crude. Electricity prices follow. Fertilizer production, heavily dependent on energy inputs, becomes more expensive. Food prices begin rising in markets thousands of miles away. This is the hidden geometry of global energy. A narrow maritime corridor suddenly influencing grocery bills in Europe and manufacturing costs in East Asia. Meanwhile, naval forces patrol the waters attempting to reassure commercial shipping that the route remains open. But reassurance is not the same thing as certainty. Every missile strike in the region, every report of drones over tanker lanes adds another layer of risk. And risk is what drives markets. The global energy system is not designed to function under persistent uncertainty. It relies on predictable flows, predictable shipping schedules, predictable contracts. When that disappears, the system begins to strain, and the Strait of Hormuz, on that narrow strip of water most people never notice, becomes something far more dangerous than a military choke point. It becomes an economic trap, one capable of pulling entire regions into the consequences of a war that began thousands of miles away. The military reality. If you listen to the early briefings that followed the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury, the language sounded familiar. Words like precision, overwhelming force, and rapid degradation of enemy capabilities dominated the discussion. Nearly 900 coordinated airstrikes were launched in the first 12 hours alone. Stealth aircraft moving through contested airspace. Cruise missiles fired from ships hundreds of miles away. Long-range bombers crossing entire continents to deliver payloads measured in tons. On paper, it looked like the kind of military operation designed to break an opponent before they even had time to respond. But modern warfare rarely unfolds according to the clean diagrams presented in planning rooms. The first complication appeared almost immediately. Many of the targets were not real. For years, Iran had studied the way modern Western militaries conduct air campaigns. They knew that satellites and aerial reconnaissance would be used to identify launch sites, so they built something to absorb those strikes. Decoys. Missile launchers constructed from sheet metal. Radar systems that looked authentic from space, but were designed purely to attract attention. Entire facilities that mimicked operational military bases, but contained little more than empty structures. When the first wave of precision weapons arrived, many of them struck those decoys, each missile costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. And while those expensive weapons were being spent, the real systems remained hidden, dispersed, or relocated. Military analysts have a quiet phrase for this kind of confrontation. They call it the economics of deception. One side spends enormous resources destroying targets. The other side spends very little creating illusions of those targets. The imbalance can be staggering. But the deeper challenge runs beyond decoys. Air power, no matter how advanced, struggles to achieve political outcomes on its own. History is almost painfully consistent on this point. Bombing campaigns can damage infrastructure, destroy equipment, and disrupt logistics. But they rarely collapse governments without additional forces on the ground. This is not a controversial observation within military circles. Iran is also uniquely prepared for this type of confrontation. The country is vast, more than 4 times the size of Iraq, with mountainous terrain, underground facilities, and military infrastructure designed to survive exactly this scenario. For decades, Iranian planners assumed that if war ever came, it would begin with an air campaign, so they prepared for it. Equipment dispersed across multiple locations, command networks buried deep underground, weapon systems designed to operate even after communications are damaged. The result is a battlefield where technological superiority alone does not guarantee quick results. Meanwhile, the cost of sustaining the campaign continues to rise. Every sortie consumes fuel, maintenance hours, and precision munitions. Modern interceptor missiles and advanced strike weapons depend on supply chains stretching across the global industrial system. And those supply chains move slowly compared to the pace of combat operations. The deeper this conflict continues, the more the mathematics of war begins to change. The side capable of producing or replacing equipment faster gains an advantage that no single airstrike can reverse. Which is why the opening phase of the war, despite its intensity, did not deliver the kind of decisive outcome many policymakers expected. Instead, it revealed something more complicated: a military campaign powerful enough to inflict enormous damage, yet operating against an opponent that spent decades preparing to survive exactly that kind of assault. And once that reality becomes clear, the next phase of the conflict becomes far less predictable. The drone equation. There's a quiet equation shaping the battlefield in this war. It is not written in strategy papers. But every military planner understands it the moment the numbers appear on the screen. The equation is cost, not just the cost of weapons, but the cost of destroying them. Modern air defense systems are marvels of engineering. Radar arrays scanning the sky hundreds of miles away. Interceptor missiles capable of striking targets moving faster than the speed of sound. Each launched the result of decades of research and billions of dollars in development. But those systems were designed to defeat advanced aircraft and sophisticated missile platforms. They were not designed for something much simpler: cheap drones. Iran has spent years developing large numbers of unmanned systems that look almost primitive compared to Western weapons technology. Many are built from inexpensive components. Some cost only tens of thousands of dollars. In some cases, even less. Yet, when those drones appear on radar screens, the response is immediate. Interceptors are launched, missiles costing millions of dollars each. That is the asymmetry defining the conflict. One side launches drones that cost roughly the price of a small car. The other responds with weapon systems worth hundreds of times more. The mathematics quickly becomes unsustainable. Iran reportedly possesses tens of thousands of drones and missiles in various configurations. Even if a large percentage are destroyed, the remaining inventory can continue to apply pressure across the region. Meanwhile, the United States entered the conflict with a finite stockpile. Replenishing those weapons is not a matter of days or weeks. Some require specialized components and advanced semiconductors. Production cannot simply surge overnight. This is where the deeper geopolitical irony appears. Many critical materials used in advanced electronics originate in supply chains, heavily influenced by China, rare earth minerals, and specialized alloys. The country Washington views as its primary strategic competitor occupies a central position inside the industrial ecosystem required for high-tech warfare. Every interceptor missile fired in the Gulf reduces the stockpile available for other potential conflicts. Replacements require time and materials. Iran understands this equation perfectly. It only needs to keep the exchange going long enough for the arithmetic to work in its favor. Because in modern warfare, sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the most advanced technology. Sometimes it is simply the cheapest one. The 5 lessons China is learning. While missiles arc across the skies of the Middle East and oil tankers idle nervously outside the Strait of Hormuz, there is another audience watching this war with extraordinary attention: Beijing. For China's military planners, this conflict is not just a geopolitical crisis. It is a live strategic laboratory. A rare opportunity to observe the world's most advanced military operating under real combat conditions. Every sortie, every interception, every supply constraint, all of it becomes data. And from that data, Chinese analysts are extracting lessons that will shape the next decade of military planning. The first lesson is about internal security. The early phase of the war revealed how deeply intelligence networks can penetrate even highly controlled political systems. The targeted elimination of key leaders suggested that human intelligence, agents inside the system, remains one of the most decisive tools in modern warfare. Beijing has already increased espionage investigations and internal security measures in response to this realization. The second lesson concerns diplomacy. In Chinese strategic culture, negotiations often coexist with preparation for conflict. But watching diplomatic discussions collapse into military strikes has reinforced a long-standing belief in Beijing. Agreements with powerful adversaries can change suddenly. Diplomacy, in this view, is not always a guarantee of stability. The third lesson is the enduring importance of hard power. However advanced cyber capabilities may become, military force still determines outcomes. China's ongoing expansion of naval fleets and missile forces reflects a belief that technological superiority must remain the backbone of national security. The fourth lesson is perhaps the most sobering. Destruction does not automatically produce victory. Airstrikes can devastate infrastructure, yet political objectives remain elusive. Governments rarely collapse simply because their facilities are bombed. Populations under attack often rally rather than fragment. And the fifth lesson is self-reliance. Iran's decades of operating under sanctions forced it to build domestic manufacturing capabilities and independent supply chains. For Beijing, That example reinforces a strategic priority: building an economy and military structure capable of surviving isolation if necessary. But there is a sixth lesson China is learning quietly, one that analysts in Washington may not fully appreciate yet. Modern war reveals as much about the attacker as it does about the defender. Every move the United States makes provides China with a clearer understanding of how America fights and where the limits of its power begin. As the world watches the conflict, Beijing is drafting the blueprints for the future. The financial time bomb. Most people assume the most dangerous weapon in a war is something you can see. A missile streaking across the sky, a drone buzzing toward a target, a warship moving through contested waters. But the most dangerous weapon in this conflict may not be military at all. It may be financial. Buried inside the global economic system is a structure so vast that even most economists struggle to fully grasp its scale. The global derivatives market, contracts tied to commodities, currencies, and financial assets, carries a value estimated between $600 trillion and $1 quadrillion. That is not a typo. It is several times larger than the entire global economy. Now, not all of those contracts represent real money. Many are hedges, insurance policies, or speculative positions. But they share one critical feature. They depend on stability. They depend on predictable price movements and manageable volatility. Energy prices sit at the center of that system. Oil futures, shipping derivatives, refinery hedging, and airline fuel swaps. Global finance is built on the assumption that energy prices move within a relatively stable range, but wars shatter those assumptions. If oil moves gradually, markets adjust. But if oil surges rapidly toward $200 per barrel, something very different happens. Derivative contracts start triggering margin calls. Traders who bet on stable prices must suddenly post more collateral. Institutions discover they are responsible for enormous payouts. If enough participants cannot cover obligations, the stress spreads through the financial system. Banks become exposed. Insurance markets tighten. Credit conditions change almost overnight. Imagine an insurance company that sold millions of policies assuming accidents occur occasionally. Then suddenly, every policyholder crashes their car on the same day. The math stops working. Energy markets have already begun to show signs of strain. Shipping insurance premiums for vessels entering the Gulf have climbed sharply. Charter rates for oil tankers are rising. The financial system was built for stability, but the Strait of Hormuz has become one of the most unstable locations on Earth. If that instability continues, the most dangerous explosion in this war may occur inside the financial architecture that supports the global economy. The new financial system emerging. While Western governments focus on missiles, drones, and naval patrols in the Persian Gulf, another transformation is unfolding quietly in the background. It is happening inside the global financial system. For decades, the international economy revolved around a single architecture. The US dollar as the primary reserve currency, the SWIFT network as the backbone of international banking communication, and Western financial institutions acting as the central clearinghouses. That structure gave Washington enormous power. Sanctions could isolate countries almost instantly. Bank accounts could be frozen. Transactions could be blocked. Entire economies could be cut off from the financial bloodstream of the world. But systems built on power inevitably generate incentives for alternatives. And over the last decade, China has been constructing one. At first, it looked modest. The cross-border interbank payment system known as CIPS was introduced as a complementary settlement network. Early volumes were small compared to the massive scale of SWIFT, but the system has been growing steadily. Today, it processes hundreds of billions of yuan in daily transactions, connecting banks across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. It does not replace the dollar-based system yet, but it creates a parallel channel for when access to Western networks becomes uncertain. Alongside that system, China has been experimenting with new financial tools. Digital currency platforms capable of settling international payments almost instantly. Infrastructure projects funded through long-term commodity agreements rather than traditional bank loans. Bilateral trade arrangements where goods move directly between partners without ever touching dollar-based clearing systems. Iran, isolated from Western banking networks for years, has become one of the laboratories for this new architecture. Oil shipments exchanged for infrastructure projects. Industrial materials traded for machinery. Financial transactions routed through networks that Western regulators struggle to monitor or control. Each transaction is small on its own, but together they represent something larger, a slow fragmentation of the financial order. And wars like the one now unfolding in the Middle East accelerate that process. Because every time sanctions are deployed, every time financial networks are weaponized, the incentive to build alternatives becomes stronger. China understands that dynamic perfectly. And while missiles dominate the headlines, Beijing may be building something far more enduring. A parallel financial system designed to function even when the old one begins to fracture. The question nobody wants to ask. When this war eventually ends, the geopolitical landscape will not return to what it was before February 28th. Something deeper is shifting beneath the surface. The Gulf states are already questioning the reliability of American security guarantees. New alliances are quietly forming. Energy systems are being redesigned. Financial networks are fragmenting. And while missiles dominate the headlines, the real transformation is happening inside the structure of the global economy. The United States entered this conflict believing it could reshape the strategic environment of the Middle East. Instead, the war may end up reshaping the structure of global power itself. China has tested its sanctions-resistant financial architecture under real wartime conditions. Russia has strengthened its role as an energy supplier to Asia. And the Gulf states are now openly exploring security and economic partnerships that bypass Washington entirely. The post-American Gulf era is no longer a theory. It is already beginning. And that leaves us with the most uncomfortable question of all, not who wins this war, but what the world looks like after it. Because the cost of this transformation will not be paid by the generals who planned it or the politicians who authorized it. It will be paid by ordinary people, by the merchant mariner navigating a burning shipping lane in the Strait of Hormuz, by the family paying $10 a gallon for gasoline, by the retiree whose pension fund is tied to markets that were never designed to absorb a global energy shock, and by the young worker who suddenly discovers that food prices have doubled because fertilizer and shipping costs exploded. This is how geopolitical shifts actually reach everyday life. Not through headlines, through inflation, shortages, and financial instability. So I want to leave you with one question. Not a rhetorical one, but a real one. Are you ready for $10 gasoline and a global financial shock for the sake of another Middle Eastern war? Think about that. And if this breakdown helped you understand what is really happening beneath the headlines, make sure you hit the like button. It helps push this kind of analysis into the algorithm so more people can see it. And subscribe to the channel for more breakdowns. If you want to go even deeper, you can also become a channel member to support the research and analysis that makes videos like this possible. Because the next phase of this crisis may already be unfolding, and when it does, we'll break it down here. Stay informed.